The year is 1990. The world is changing with optimism in the air. Yet in the Middle East, a different storm is gathering. This region, rich in oil, is a complex web of rivalries. This is the story of a conflict that would test the world's optimism. On the Persian Gulf's northern shore lies Iraq, ruled by Saddam Hussein. To its south sits Kuwait. The events that will take place here will capture the attention of the entire world. At the center of this crisis is Saddam Hussein, a man who rose to absolute power. Kuwait, in contrast to Iraq, is a tiny nation of immense wealth. Now, in the summer of 1990, tensions are about to reach a boiling point. The Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988 cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Iraq received financial support from Gulf neighbors like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, who saw Saddam's regime as a buffer against Iran. After the ceasefire, Iraq was financially ruined, owing billions. Saddam felt entitled to debt forgiveness, viewing it as payment for defending the Arab world. Iraq's economy depended on oil revenues, but prices fell. Saddam blamed Kuwait and the UAE for overproducing, accusing them of economic warfare. He needed a victory to restore Iraq's finances and his power. This led Saddam towards a fateful decision. As the summer of 1990 began, rhetoric from Baghdad grew hostile. Saddam Hussein accused Kuwait of stealing oil from the Rumaila oil field, claiming slant drilling was used to siphon billions. He claimed historical sovereignty over Kuwait, viewing it as a lost province. The Arab League tried to mediate, but negotiations in Jeddah were fraught with mistrust. Iraq demanded debt cancellation, compensation, and territorial concessions. The talks collapsed, revealing Saddam's disinterest in diplomacy. While diplomats talked, Republican Guard units massed along the Kuwait border. World leaders underestimated his ambition and desperation. In July 1990, the signs of conflict were impossible to ignore. Satellite imagery showed Iraqi military build-up along the Kuwaiti border. The world watched with growing anxiety as the United States issued warnings to Saddam Hussein. Saddam may have misinterpreted the American position, believing the United States wouldn't intervene. The Cold War was over, and Saddam may have calculated that the world was weary of conflict. He may have believed a swift military operation to seize Kuwait would be met with condemnation, but not a major military response. It was a colossal miscalculation. Kuwait's neighbors engaged in frantic last-minute diplomacy, but Saddam Hussein was unmoved. He saw Kuwait as the key to solving all his problems. And so, on the night of August 1st, 1990, the world held its breath. On the border, Iraqi tank commanders awaited their final orders. The invasion of Kuwait was imminent. In the pre-dawn darkness of August 2nd, 1990, the order was given. The engines of over 1,000 Iraqi tanks roared to life. They surged across the border into Kuwait. The invasion was a meticulously planned blitzkrieg designed for maximum speed and shock. Iraqi forces advanced, their primary objective being Kuwait City, catching the small Kuwaiti military almost completely by surprise. By sunrise, Iraqi forces had penetrated deep into Kuwaiti territory. He was on the verge of swallowing an entire nation in a single lightning-fast strike. As Iraqi forces stormed Kuwait City, chaos erupted. The Dasman Palace, home of the Emir, became the focal point of fierce fighting. The Emir's royal guard, outnumbered but resolute, held off Iraqi commandos long enough for the Emir and key officials to escape. Sheikh Fahad al-Ahmad al-Jaber al-Sabah, the Emir's brother, was killed defending the palace, becoming a symbol of resistance. The palace fell, but the government's escape ensured Kuwait's voice would survive in exile. By nightfall, Iraqi troops controlled the city, replacing Kuwaiti flags with their own. For Kuwaitis, a dark occupation had begun, but their nation's spirit endured. In exile, the Emir's government wielded its financial power to rally global support. They launched a relentless diplomatic campaign, exposing Iraqi atrocities and championing Kuwaiti resistance. Inside occupied Kuwait, citizens risked everything, hiding foreigners, spreading underground news, and sabotaging Iraqi forces. The exiled government amplified these acts, uniting resistance at home and abroad. Their efforts kept Kuwait's plight in the world's spotlight and built the foundation for an international coalition. Saddam's claim over Kuwait was rejected by both its people and the world. The fight for Kuwait's freedom had only just begun. The invasion stunned the world, shattering hopes for post-Cold War peace. The UN Security Council swiftly condemned Iraq, demanding immediate withdrawal. No vetoes, not even from the Soviets. This rare unity isolated Saddam and set the stage for global action. President Bush, urged by Margaret Thatcher, declared, "This will not stand." Oil prices soared, and the world recognized the threat to economic stability. Legal, political, and economic outrage fueled momentum for a collective response. The groundwork for a new world order was laid. With Iraq on Saudi Arabia's doorstep, the stakes soared. President Bush moved fast, offering military protection to King Fahd, who accepted after seeing the threat. Operation Desert Shield began. US troops landed, drawing a literal line in the sand. The message to Saddam was clear. Any move south meant war with America. The coalition grew rapidly, transforming defense into preparation for Kuwait's liberation. The world's largest military buildup was underway. The Gulf War's diplomatic and military foundations were set. As troops secured Saudi Arabia, diplomacy took center stage. The US and allies rallied the world, imposing crippling sanctions on Iraq. The Soviet Union joined the condemnation, leaving Saddam isolated. The Arab League, after heated debate, condemned Iraq and sent troops to the coalition. Saddam's narrative of Arab unity collapsed. The coalition's legitimacy grew, uniting East and West, Arab and non-Arab. The world stood together against aggression. Behind the scenes, Bush and Thatcher forged a determined alliance. Thatcher's resolve, "This is no time to go wobbly," galvanized Bush and set the coalition's tone. Britain was first to send forces, proving America wasn't alone and encouraging others to join. Both leaders saw echoes of past aggressions and knew appeasement was not an option. Their clear moral messaging built public support for action. The Anglo-American partnership became the backbone of the coalition's resolve. The coalition that took shape in the deserts of Saudi Arabia was truly historic in its scale and diversity. It was not simply a Western alliance, it was a global one. By the time military operations began, forces from 39 different countries had come together, united under a single UN-backed mandate. This was an unprecedented display of international cooperation. Alongside the massive contingents from the United States and the United Kingdom, significant forces arrived from France, Canada, and Italy. The coalition was a patchwork of different languages, cultures, and military doctrines, all working towards a common goal, the liberation of Kuwait. Crucially, the coalition included major contributions from Arab and Muslim nations. The presence of troops from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Syria, Morocco, and the Gulf states was of immense political and symbolic importance. It powerfully refuted Saddam Hussein's propaganda that he was leading a holy war, or jihad, against Western invaders and their corrupt Arab puppets. The sight of Syrian tanks deploying alongside American ones, or Egyptian soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder with British Marines, sent a clear message. It showed that the fight was not a clash of civilizations, but a united stand by the international community, including much of the Arab world, against a regional aggressor. Even nations from outside the region, with no direct strategic interest in the Gulf, joined the effort. Countries like Argentina, Australia, and South Korea provided military, medical, or financial support. This broad participation reinforced the global nature of the consensus against Iraq's invasion. It underscored the principle of collective security, the idea that an attack on one nation is a concern for all. The coalition demonstrated that the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter were not just abstract ideals, but could be defended by a powerful and diverse concert of nations willing to act in concert to uphold them. Building and maintaining this disparate alliance was a monumental logistical and political challenge. General Norman Schwarzkopf, the American commander of the coalition forces, had to carefully navigate the cultural sensitivities and differing military capabilities of the various contingents. Political leaders had to constantly manage the different and sometimes conflicting agendas of the coalition partners. Some were there purely to defend Saudi Arabia, while others were prepared for offensive operations to liberate Kuwait. Holding this complex and sometimes fragile coalition together required constant communication, compromise, and a clear, unifying objective which the UN resolutions provided. As Operation Desert Shield grew, the international community sought a peaceful resolution. Economic sanctions took a toll, but Saddam remained defiant, leading to a critical decision at the UN. Resolution 678 authorized the use of all necessary means if Iraq didn't withdraw from Kuwait by January 15, 1991. Diplomacy failed, and the path to war was closing. While the diplomats debated, the military build-up in the Persian Gulf continued at an astonishing pace. Operation Desert Shield was, honestly, one of the largest and most rapid deployments of military power in modern history. Day and night, a constant stream of massive cargo planes and transport ships arrived in Saudi Arabia and the surrounding Gulf states. They brought with them hundreds of thousands of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and marines. They carried an incredible arsenal of the most advanced military technology of the era. M1 Abrams tanks, Apache attack helicopters, F-15 Eagle fighter jets, and sophisticated Patriot missile defense systems. The logistical scale of the operation was immense. Entire cities of tents and prefabricated buildings sprang up in the barren desert to house the coalition forces. Miles of pipelines were laid to supply the vast quantities of water and fuel required by the troops and their machines. Ports were expanded to handle the endless convoys of ships, and airfields were transformed into bustling hubs for the most powerful air force ever assembled. By January 1991, more than 500,000 American troops were in the region, alongside over 200,000 soldiers from the other coalition partners. The desert had been transformed into a massive military staging area. The months of Operation Desert Shield were not idle. They were a period of intense training and acclimatization. Troops from dozens of countries had to learn to operate together, overcoming differences in language, equipment, and military procedures. They conducted massive exercises in the harsh desert environment, rehearsing the complex maneuvers they would need to execute if war came. The heat, the sand, and the constant tension tested the soldiers' endurance and resolve. They were preparing for a high-intensity conflict against a large, battle-hardened Iraqi army that was dug into formidable defensive positions in Kuwait and southern Iraq. As the January 15th deadline set by the United Nations approached, a palpable sense of anticipation settled over the entire region. The diplomatic options had been exhausted. The largest international military coalition in half a century was assembled and ready. The mission had evolved from simply defending Saudi Arabia to preparing for the liberation of Kuwait. Operation Desert Shield, the protective phase, was about to end. The world watched and waited, hoping for a peaceful outcome but bracing for war. The gathering storm, which had been building for 5 long months, was now poised to unleash its full fury upon Saddam Hussein's forces. With the UN deadline passed, the world watched. Then, on January 17th, the desert night was shattered. Operation Desert Storm began with an overwhelming air assault. Stealth aircraft and cruise missiles struck key Iraqi targets. Command centers, communication hubs, and government buildings were hit. For 5 weeks, coalition aircraft flew relentlessly, targeting the Iraqi war machine. Airfields, bridges, and supply depots were destroyed. The air campaign was broadcast live, defining the image of the war for the world. But on the ground, it was a terrifying experience. As the air campaign ended, the Iraqi army began to collapse and retreat from Kuwait. On February 26th, a massive column of vehicles packed onto Highway 80, leading to Basra, becoming the scene of a harrowing event. Coalition air power intercepted the retreating army using A-10S to disable vehicles, trapping thousands. The highway became a shooting gallery, resulting in utter carnage and becoming known as the Highway of Death. The images sparked controversy, questioning the ethics of attacking a retreating army. The Highway of Death remains a controversial reminder of the brutal reality of conflict. With the Iraqi army in Kuwait severely weakened by the air campaign, Coalition Commander General Norman Schwarzkopf gave the order to begin the ground war. At 4 a.m. on February 24, 1991, a massive force of over 500,000 coalition troops surged across the border into Kuwait and southern Iraq. This was, honestly, the moment the world had been waiting for with apprehension. Many analysts had predicted a long and bloody ground conflict with high casualties on both sides. They expected the battle-hardened Iraqi army, dug into extensive defensive fortifications, to put up a fierce and protracted resistance against the coalition forces. However, Schwarzkopf had a brilliant and audacious plan. While US Marines and Arab coalition forces mounted a frontal assault directly into Kuwait, drawing the attention of the main Iraqi defenses, the bulk of the coalition's armored forces executed a daring maneuver far out to the west. This was the famous Hail Mary Pass, or as it became known, the Left Hook. Hundreds of thousands of American, British and French troops swept deep into Iraqi territory, outflanking the formidable Iraqi defensive lines entirely. Their objective was to encircle the elite Republican Guard divisions in southern Iraq, cutting off their escape routes and destroying them in the open desert. The speed and scale of the Left Hook caught the Iraqi command completely by surprise. The Iraqi army, with its rigid top-down command structure, had been prepared for a head-on battle of attrition, similar to the trench warfare of the Iran-Iraq War. They were, quite frankly, psychologically and strategically unprepared for such a fluid and fast-paced war of maneuver. Coalition forces, equipped with superior tanks like the American M1 Abrams and the British Challenger, and aided by GPS navigation, advanced rapidly across the desert. They bypassed Iraqi positions, engaged enemy forces on their own terms, and pushed relentlessly towards their objectives. The Iraqi resistance, which many had feared would be so strong, largely crumbled. After weeks of bombing, many Iraqi soldiers were demoralized, short of supplies and eager to surrender. Thousands of conscript soldiers gave up without a fight, sometimes to journalists or, remarkably, even to unmanned drones. While some units, particularly the Republican Guard, did fight hard in isolated engagements, the overall Iraqi defense disintegrated with astonishing speed. The ground war, which was expected to last for weeks or even months, was turning into a rout. The strategy of the Left Hook was working with devastating and decisive effect. Within the swift advance of the Left Hook, several major battles took place that sealed the fate of the Iraqi army. The most significant of these was the Battle of 73 Easting, which occurred on February 26, 1991. The name refers to a north-south grid line on military GPS maps, a featureless line in the sand where one of the largest tank battles in American history would unfold. The US Army's 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, acting as a reconnaissance screen for the main 7th Corps, advanced deep into Iraq and ran directly into dug-in elements of the Iraqi Republican Guard's Tawakalna division. The battle began in the midst of a fierce desert sandstorm which severely limited visibility. The American M1A1 Abrams tanks and M3 Bradley fighting vehicles possessed a crucial technological advantage: advanced thermal sights. This equipment allowed their gunners to see through the dust, smoke and darkness, detecting the heat signatures of the Iraqi tanks long before the American vehicles could be seen. The Iraqi T-72 tanks, by contrast, had inferior night vision capabilities and were effectively fighting blind. This technological gap proved to be absolutely decisive on the battlefield, turning a potential clash of equals into a one-sided engagement. The engagement was fought at close quarters with brutal efficiency. American tank commanders, using superior tactics and communication, coordinated their fire to devastating effect. They were able to identify and destroy Iraqi tanks and armored vehicles with remarkable speed and accuracy, often with the very first shot. The Iraqi tankers, though brave, were simply outmatched. They were unable to effectively locate and engage the coalition forces that were systematically destroying their positions. In the space of just a few hours, A powerful Iraqi armored force was almost completely annihilated, while American casualties were exceptionally light. The Battle of 73 Easting, along with other similar engagements like the Battle of Medina Ridge, was a microcosm of the entire ground war. It demonstrated the vast technological and doctrinal superiority of the coalition forces. It was, in essence, a clash between a 21st century military and a military still structured for 20th century warfare. The battle effectively broke the back of the Republican Guard's resistance in that sector, clearing the way for the coalition to complete its encirclement of Iraqi forces in the Kuwaiti theatre of operations. The decisive victory at 73 Easting ensured that the path to liberating Kuwait was now wide open. While battles raged in the desert, the liberation of Kuwait City was underway. On February 25th, US Marines and Arab coalition partners pushed into the city. Kuwaiti citizens poured into the streets to celebrate the arrival of their liberators after months of brutal occupation. The joy was tempered by the scars of occupation and hundreds of burning oil wells. The liberation revealed the full extent of the brutality and human rights abuses of the Iraqi occupation. By February 27th, Kuwait City was secured, marking a comprehensive military victory for the international coalition. With Kuwait liberated and the Iraqi army in the theatre of operations facing complete annihilation, the leaders of the coalition faced a critical decision, whether to stop the advance or to push on towards Baghdad and remove Saddam Hussein from power. The United Nations mandate for the war, as laid out in Resolution 678, was limited to the liberation of Kuwait. Exceeding that mandate by invading Iraq and occupying its capital would have shattered the carefully constructed international coalition, particularly its Arab partners. President George H.W. Bush, mindful of these constraints, made the decision to halt the offensive. On February 28, 1991, exactly 100 hours after the ground war began, President Bush announced that coalition forces would suspend all offensive combat operations. A unilateral ceasefire was declared. The war was over. The decision to stop was, and remains, a subject of intense debate. Some, including military commanders on the ground, argued that they should have been allowed to finish the job and destroy the remnants of the Republican Guard, which were escaping back towards Baghdad. They believed that leaving Saddam Hussein in power was a strategic mistake that would have future consequences. However, the political logic for stopping was compelling. Pushing to Baghdad would have transformed the mission from one of liberation to one of occupation, with unpredictable costs in lives and resources. It would have violated the international consensus that had given the war its legitimacy. President Bush and his advisors hoped that such a humiliating defeat would lead the Iraqi people or the military to overthrow Saddam Hussein from within. This assumption would prove to be mistaken. Saddam, though defeated, survived, brutally suppressing uprisings by Shia Muslims in the south and Kurds in the north that erupted shortly after the ceasefire. The formal end of hostilities was negotiated at a captured Iraqi airfield called Safwan on March 3rd. General Schwarzkopf met with a delegation of Iraqi generals. In a tense meeting inside a military tent, the Iraqis accepted all coalition terms for a permanent ceasefire, including the return of all prisoners of war and the recognition of Kuwait's sovereignty. The swift and decisive victory of Operation Desert Storm was officially complete. The conflict had redrawn the military and political map of the Middle East, but by ending the war with Saddam Hussein still in power, it also left behind a legacy of unfinished business that would shape the region for years to come. The guns fell silent, but the conflict was not formally over. A meeting was set for March 3rd at Safwan, just inside Iraqi territory. Coalition Commander General Norman Schwarzkopf met with defeated Iraqi generals. Inside a simple army tent, the terms for the end of hostilities were laid out. Schwarzkopf presented a series of non-negotiable demands, including the release of prisoners, information on landmines, and renouncing claims to Kuwait. It was a clear surrender. The Safwan Accord formalized the end of the Gulf War, cementing the coalition's victory. However, the peace established at Safwan was an uneasy one, leaving Saddam Hussein in power and setting the stage for future confrontation. As Kuwait celebrated its liberation, it woke up to an environmental catastrophe of unprecedented scale. In the final, desperate days of their occupation, the retreating Iraqi forces had enacted a scorched earth policy of staggering malice. They systematically sabotaged Kuwait's oil infrastructure, dynamiting and setting fire to over 700 oil wells. The result was an apocalyptic vision. Across the desert landscape, massive plumes of thick black smoke billowed into the sky from roaring infernos that shot hundreds of feet into the air. The smoke was so dense that it blotted out the sun, casting a dark, oily twilight over Kuwait City during the day. The environmental impact was devastating. The fires consumed an estimated 6 million barrels of oil each day, releasing a toxic cocktail of soot, sulfur dioxide, and other pollutants into the atmosphere. The black smoke plumes stretched for hundreds of miles, visible from space. Oily black rain fell on countries across the Persian Gulf region, and the soot was detected as far away as the Himalayas. On the ground, vast lakes of crude oil formed across the desert, seeping into the sand, threatening the fragile desert ecosystem and contaminating underground water supplies. The scale of the disaster was unlike anything the world had ever seen before. Tackling this disaster required a monumental international effort. Specialist firefighting companies from around the world, including teams led by the legendary Red Adair, were brought in to confront the blazes. The task was incredibly dangerous and difficult. The firefighters worked in extreme heat, surrounded by unexploded ordnance and clouds of toxic fumes. They used a variety of techniques, from spraying the wells with massive amounts of water to detonating explosive charges at the wellheads to snuff out the flames. It was a slow, arduous and heroic process, a new kind of war waged against an environmental inferno. It took nearly 9 months of continuous work to extinguish the last of the fires. The final blaze was put out in November 1991, but the environmental damage would linger for decades. The cleanup of the oil lakes and the restoration of the desert landscape would become a long and costly process. The Kuwaiti oil fires were a stark and powerful symbol of the destructive nature of the conflict. They were a deliberate act of environmental warfare, a final, spiteful act by a defeated regime that left a deep and lasting scar not just on the nation of Kuwait, but on the planet itself. The Gulf War was a military victory for the coalition, achieved with remarkably low human cost. For Iraq, it was a human catastrophe. The economic costs were staggering for all involved, pushing Iraq into near-total collapse. The political costs reshaped the Middle East. It established the United States as the dominant power in the region. However, the war also sowed the seeds of future conflicts and inadvertently helped to fuel extremist movements. In the immediate aftermath of the ceasefire, President George H.W. Bush publicly called on the Iraqi people and military to take matters into their own hands and overthrow Saddam Hussein. Many Iraqis, particularly in the long-oppressed Shia majority in the south and the Kurdish population in the north, took this as a signal of American support. Believing that the United States would protect them from Saddam's regime, they rose up in a massive, spontaneous rebellion. In March 1991, cities across southern Iraq, such as Basra and Karbala, fell to popular uprisings, while in the north, Kurdish Peshmerga fighters took control of major cities like Kirkuk and Erbil. For a few brief, hopeful weeks, it seemed as though Saddam Hussein's regime was on the verge of collapse. The rebels, armed with captured weapons and filled with revolutionary fervor, controlled large swathes of the country. However, their hope for American intervention was tragically misplaced. The Bush administration, having achieved its stated goal of liberating Kuwait, had no desire to be drawn into a messy and unpredictable civil war in Iraq. Fearing the potential fragmentation of the country and the rise of an Iran-aligned Shia state in the south, the United States made a deliberate decision to stand by and watch. This decision allowed Saddam Hussein, who had retained control of his most loyal Republican Guard units and his helicopter gunships, to exact a terrible revenge. Using the very helicopters that General Schwarzkopf had permitted him to fly at Safwan, Saddam unleashed a wave of unimaginable brutality against the rebels. His forces systematically crushed the uprisings city by city. They used tanks and artillery to shell residential areas and carried out summary executions of suspected rebels. In the south, thousands were massacred, while in the north, the crackdown created a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions. Fearing for their lives, nearly 2 million Kurdish civilians fled their homes and sought refuge in the freezing, inhospitable mountains along the borders with Turkey and Iran. The images of their suffering, broadcast around the world, created a new international outcry. While the coalition had won the war to liberate Kuwait, its inaction in the face of the uprisings was seen by many Iraqis as a profound betrayal. They felt they had been encouraged to rebel and were then abandoned to their fate. This sense of betrayal would poison relations between the United States and many Iraqis for years to come. Against all odds, Saddam Hussein survived. His survival was a testament to his own ruthlessness and the unwavering loyalty of his core security apparatus. These were the instruments he used to crush the rebellions and re-establish his authority. He skillfully portrayed the Gulf War not as a defeat, but as a heroic victory. The imposition of severe United Nations sanctions allowed Saddam to control the distribution of all food and medicine. Ultimately, the decision by the coalition to end the war without removing Saddam from power was the key to his survival. The tyrant had endured. With Saddam Hussein still in power and a humanitarian crisis in northern Iraq, the international community acted. The UN passed Resolution 688 condemning the repression of Iraqi civilians. To protect the Kurds, the US, Britain and France launched Operation Provide Comfort. This established a safe haven and a no-fly zone north of the 36th parallel. The primary tool of containment was economic sanctions, intended to force Iraq to dismantle its weapons programs. UN weapons inspectors were sent to oversee this process, leading to a decade-long standoff. The sanctions caused immense suffering and, combined with Saddam's defiance, ensured Iraq remained a major international concern. The Gulf War of 1990–91 reshaped the Middle East's political and military landscape. Iraq was severely weakened, creating a power vacuum for Iran. The most significant outcome was the dramatic expansion of American military presence in the region. This deployment became a semi-permanent fixture. It also became a major source of resentment and a recruiting tool for extremist groups. For figures like Osama bin Laden, the stationing of troops on Saudi soil was a profound insult, linking the aftermath of the war to the attacks of September 11th. The war was a catalyst for change, setting in motion forces that continue to shape the region today. The Gulf War showcased a revolution in military affairs. The world witnessed the effectiveness of stealth aircraft, cruise missiles, and GPS navigation. This superiority allowed the coalition to achieve its objectives with speed and decisiveness. War was broadcast into living rooms, but often sanitized. The iconic images created the impression of a clean video game war, obscuring the brutal reality. The Highway of Death revealed the horrific carnage. The focus on technology minimized the suffering of the Iraqi people. Subsequent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan demonstrated the limitations of this model. Ending the war with Saddam still in power was perhaps the most consequential choice. It left a legacy of unfinished business that would define the relationship between Iraq and the world for the next 12 years. Saddam Hussein, though defeated, remained a defiant and destabilizing presence. The UN sanctions and weapons inspections created a decade-long cat-and-mouse game. Policymakers viewed Saddam through a lens of defiance, believing containment had failed. The First Gulf War can be seen as Act 1, concluding with the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The 1991 Gulf War was a unique moment of global consensus, with the UN acting decisively against aggression. Seen as a triumph for a new world order, it showed the world's united political will and military power. Diplomacy, economic pressure and force were key, but military victory didn't guarantee lasting peace. Leaving Saddam in power led to future conflict, and the war's aftermath had devastating consequences. The Gulf War was a pivotal moment, defining an era's end and another's beginning. It offers lessons about war, peace, and building a stable world order.